Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Social Justice Calling, NGO Work in International Education in South Asia. My name is Jeff Murphy, and I'm an Associate Director in the BU Alumni Relations Office, as well as a proud alumnus of the BU Questrom School of Business. Today's webinar is sponsored by the BU Alumni Association and is offered to our 300,000 alumni around the globe as part of our annual Global Days of Service. Throughout the month of April, BU alumni, students, and staff will engage in thousands of hours of volunteer projects in cities all over the globe. Whether you're in Thailand or Texas, still on ComAv, or out in California, join us in making a difference by visiting the GDS website at www.bu.edu/Global Days of Service. Before I introduce today's speaker, some brief housekeeping notes. As you know by now, this webinar is being hosted on the Adobe Connect online meeting platform. If you experience any trouble with the audio or visual portions of this presentation, I'll ask that you please contact Adobe Connect directly. If you want to jot down the phone number, it's 1-800-422-3623. Today's presentation is being recorded and will soon be made available for on-demand viewing on the BU Alumni Association website found at www.bu.edu/alumni. Our speaker today is very eager to answer any questions you may have, and you're welcome to submit them throughout the presentation using the question and answer chat box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. We're going to ask some questions of the audience, and we hope that you will chat in with as many questions as you have during today's webinar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the day. Presenting from outside of New Delhi, India is College of Arts and Sciences alumna Jane Schukoske. Jane is the Chief Executive Officer of Sehgal Foundation, an NGO working in the rural development sector in India. She earned her BA at Boston University, a JD at Vanderbilt University School of Law, and an LLM at Georgetown University Law Center. A legal aid lawyer and law professor in the U.S., she became acquainted with South Asia as a senior Fulbright scholar in Sri Lanka in 1995 to 96. She served in New Delhi as executive director of the U.S. Educational Foundation in India from 2000 to 2008 and helped establish O.P. Jindal Global University in 2008 to 2009. She joined Sehgal Foundation in 2011 and also serves in several advisory positions for academic institutions in India. She's spoken at legal education conferences and judicial workshops on rural access to justice and on the role of NGOs in access to justice in India and other countries. She's a Maryland Bar member and a member of the American Bar Association International Law Section India Committee. Jane, thank you so much for being with us. I know it's getting to be a late evening out where you are in India. I'm going to go ahead and get your slide deck up and running, and then the floor will be all yours.
Jeff, thanks. I'm delighted to be on this BU Alumni Industry Insiders webinar series. One thing I realized from the bio that may not be clear to people is that the U.S. Educational Foundation in India, which is now the U.S. India Educational Foundation, is the Fulbright Commission. So I headed the Fulbright Commission here for 8 years, and if people have any questions about Fulbrights, I'm happy to take those along with everything else. We have these key themes today to discuss. The organization that I head does rural development work in India, and I'm happy to respond to questions about that. When you heard my career under discussion, as you can see, I switched from area to area rather logically, but perhaps bigger jumps than many people would take. And I'm happy to talk about that movement from being a lawyer to working in international education to actually coming back to law, but law at the grassroots rather than in the courtroom. Here at Sehgal Foundation, we work a lot on in partnership with corporations, also with other foundations, government, other NGOs, and certainly communities. But for those of you who may be in the corporate sector, I'm happy to talk about relationships with NGOs. Those of you who are interested in the NGO sector or working in it, happy to talk about that. International exchange has been very important in my life, and as you could tell from the bio, I've done a lot of it in sort of a formal way as well as informally, and I'm interested in knowing what those of you who are participating in the webinar think about international exchange, what insights you have, what learnings you've had from it. And finally, I'm at a point in my life where, and it's been the case for my whole career really, that meaningful work has been extremely important. I suppose that means I've been able to come up with enough revenue from work to be reasonably comfortable. And my main focus has been on doing work that is meaningful to me and that I see as a contribution to the world. So before going any farther, I'd like to ask you a few questions, which Jeff will help you answer in a poll box. So my first question is, where are you? Are you in Massachusetts? Are you in the US outside Massachusetts? Are you in North America outside USA, or are you somewhere else? My second question is, in what sector do you work, or did you work if you're retired? Private, public, government, civil society, other? And finally, why did you sign up for this webinar? Are you interested in a career abroad or in an internship for yourself or your child or someone else? Have you had or do you want an international exchange visit? Are you interested in India? I see one of our participants has an Indian last name, so I'm curious about that. And is it none of the above and you're basically interested in the alumni webinar series?
And Jane, as we've got people chatting in with or selecting their answers, I also want to point out that for questions 2 and 3, in what sector do you work and why did you sign up for this webinar, you're welcome to select more than one answer. I know that's sort of a nuts and bolts point at this time, but I wanted to make sure that people know that. And Jane, you can see that people are responding in with their answers. Looks like we have a lot of folks outside of Massachusetts joining us today.
Great.
Pretty even split for the sector that people are working in and for reasons for signing up.
Right. Okay. And everybody can see those answers. Is that right?
Yeah, everybody should be able to see the results.
Right. Okay. So I see there's a lot of interest in the career internship part. And it would be fine for those of you who gave that answer to send in the question and answer box anything further you want to say about that. That may be helpful for me to know later. I think Jeff will collect those and let me know as the webinar goes along. But
Absolutely.
if it's you personally who are interested, that may be different than if you're asking questions for your child or some friend. All right, so thanks very much for that participation. Jeff, can you move those?
I sure can.
All right, I just wanted to start us off with a visual image of the people that we work with. So this is a shot from Rajasthan, and now I want to bring you back to questions just to plant these in your mind. We will come back to these at the end of the webinar, but basically, what's your interest in rural development? Have you lived abroad for study or work? What have you learned from it? And what social justice issues top your list of priorities? So that'll come up at the end. Jeff went over my bio in terms of my education. And I would say that the first thing I did, as you see, was French. And I was a French teacher for a year. And I enjoy French, love it, enjoyed studying abroad to learn it. But as a teacher and as a very young woman at that time, I felt I had no power. Now, I have great respect for teachers and I encourage people to be teachers. But personally, I didn't have the patience to be in the system. And so I immediately went to law school. And in order to, in a sense, change my knowledge of the world and change my status, I was raised on a farm. And so neither of my parents had a college education. So education was very important to me. And what I found was that by studying law, I learned about all the other systems in the world that I didn't know about, like corporations and government, and NGO, civil society sector. So I was a legal aid lawyer for 9 years, 6 years as a practitioner manager, and 3 years heading the Virginia Poverty Law Center. So I've also always gravitated into leadership positions, seeing the broad picture in front of me of a particular sector and trying to help people within that broad broad view, help people do their best. So after 3 years at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, I decided to go back to study more, and I went to Georgetown and got an LLM. That LLM helped me move into law school teaching. It was an additional credential, and also being at Georgetown thinking about teaching gave me perspectives that were very helpful in the classroom and in designing classes and working with students in a way that they would have very active hands-on learning in addition to theoretical learning. So University of Baltimore was hiring a cluster of professors to expand their clinical legal education program, and I was one of the ones that they hired. So that gave me the opportunity to design clinics. And I first designed a housing clinic, then changed it into a environmental justice clinic, and finally designed a community development clinic that basically included all the environmental justice work, only represented groups, which is critically important in Baltimore. Baltimore's been so much in the news. And that clinic is still running, I'm very proud to say, the Community Development Clinic at University of Baltimore. During my time as a professor, I was also teaching classroom courses, law and social reform as a paper course, ethics, contracts. I, during that time, had applied for a Fulbright, and the first thing I'll say about Fulbright is that I applied for one in South Africa and didn't get it. So I then applied again, and I applied for a Fulbright to Nepal, and Nepal picked me but couldn't place me for various technical reasons in the country. So they floated my resume and asked if any other country in South Asia would like to take a good candidate who didn't have a place to go. So Sri Lanka said, yes, we'd love to take her. And so that put me in a position of going to a country that I hadn't planned to go to. And fortunately, as a professor, I could very quickly convene a little group of researchers, research assistants, whom I had do research on Sri Lankan law, Sri Lanka and women, Sri Lanka and environment, and so forth, and was able to put together a good project for that placement. I returned after the Fulbright to University of Baltimore and taught. That was the time of the Community Development Clinic, and then had a sabbatical. And during that sabbatical, came back to South Asia and learned that the directorship of the Fulbright Commission in India was open, and applied for it and thought I would do it for 2 years. During those 2 years, two things happened that caused me to stay 8 years, which was a major turning point in a career, and sort of a bold one, actually. So the two things that happened, one was 9/11. So while I was at Fulbright, 9/11 happened, and it had a huge impact on international exchange because there was so much concern about security. People who had been teaching for 30 years were then suddenly suspect because of their last name. And so we had a major effort to help smooth hurt feelings and yet follow safety protocols, but keep international exchange going in that time when there was such confusion. The other thing that happened was also a big confusion, and that was that I caught two embezzlers at the commission. And so that meant, of course, I had to fire them and replace them and work with a team that had had embezzlers in their midst for some time. I learned a lot from that experience, that people who are relatively innocent overall have learned to look the other way when something wrong is happening. And so to turn around an organization that has had embezzlement takes some time. So I stayed at the foundation 8 years. I enjoyed it tremendously. These issues were helpful to me in making my decision, but basically I was having a marvelous time because I had, after being in law, gotten back all the other disciplines and was able to work with our talent pool, huge talent pool of Americans and Indians who had Fulbright fellowships, to put together really interesting roundtables and have lots of good discussion, observe many good projects in the community, many good academic projects. After 8 years at the commission, I was invited to help start a university and did that for a year. Then I returned to University of Baltimore. They were happy to have me back. Of course, tenure was no longer there because I'd been away so long, but everyone knew me. And so they invited me back to head a Master of Laws on the law of the US for international lawyers. So in that program, we had people from all over the world: China, Russia, Venezuela, Kenya, and they were eager to learn about the law of the US for one of two reasons: either to take the learning home to their home country and perhaps have more credentials for doing international trade deals or other international work, or they were immigrants, people who had migrated from Cameroon, for example, and wanted to regain their legal professional status. Coming to US without a law degree in the US meant that they lost status typically. And so they were a very optimistic group of students to be working with. While I was doing that, one of my Indian friends visited Baltimore and said, "Would you like to do something else?" And knew that the Sehgal Foundation was looking for a CEO. So I was invited to interview for that in Florida, where the founder trustee lives, and was offered a 5-year contract, which I'm completing soon. So Sehgal Foundation is a public charitable trust registered in India. There is a counterpart in the United States that was registered 1 year before. SM Sehgal earned wealth from the hybrid seed business. And in that business, he was very close to farmers, of course. And so when he sold his businesses, he put more or less half of his wealth into a trust in the United States. That trust has sent annual allocations to us in India as seed money, no pun intended. And now we have many other partners in addition to the Sehgal Foundation itself. The mission is community-led, strengthening community-led development to achieve positive social, economic, and environmental change across rural India. Well, so far we're in 6 districts, and when I came to the organization in 2011, we were in 17 villages. So from 17 villages, we have expanded our team and our abilities, and are now in 497 villages last time I checked. The words community-led are really important. Because it's our approach, it's our understanding that nothing will be sustainable unless the community actually owns the change that is happening. You can't, you can go build toilets, but that doesn't convince anybody to use them. So community-led is a really important principle for us. The vision is that everybody in rural India deserves a fair chance at life, deserves to have a secure, prosperous, and dignified life. And for those of you who have visited India, you'll be aware of a big divide between the population that is comfortable, and that population is about the size of the United States population as a whole, versus the two-thirds of the population who are in rural areas. They may be comfortable, many are not. They may not have water, decent schools, decent roads, so that the poverty is significant, and there is a very big divide here between those who are comfortable living a modern life and those who are not. A core principle of the foundation is to work on the strengthening of rural governance. India devolves a lot of power to the village councils, which from an American point of view, I feel a very heavy burden is laid on the village councils. So that, for example, in villages where we work, if there's not water, there's not the approach that the state should provide it, but typically the approach is, what can the panchayat, what can the local people do to deal with their situation? What can they apply for? What local structures might help them have better water supply? And of course, there are governmental plans for water, but they're just not reaching the grassroots in a thorough way. So our work with communities, well, actually, I'll say the foundation, when they first, way before I got here, when they first went into communities, they thought that birth control would be a good way to help India. But of course, when you go talk to communities, you realize that is not your lead argument. You have to listen to people, and their first interest is water. What, of course, we learn is that as women are empowered, as girls get education, and women gain more voice in the community, that the birth control issue will actually be addressed. The people that we are working with are primarily farmers. Some of them are farmers who also have jobs as drivers, but agriculture is really important in the rural areas. So we have a main emphasis on agriculture, and we also spread awareness about health, about legal rights, and other basics. An organization like ours has a large field team. We have about 90 people in the field, and that gives us the ability to have both here in Gurgaon in the headquarters a lawyer, an agricultural economist, political scientists, social workers, communication specialists, and of course the financial and administration people. And the ability to have both that kind of educated expertise as well as grassroots practicality, grassroots connections to people to build trust and understand what's going on the ground, makes us a very good bridge between the grassroots communities and officials and academics. So part of what we do is we have a research team that undertakes research studies both on themes, thematic topics, as well as assessing the impact of the work we do and sharing that. As I mentioned, governance is a key program, and we've tried several things. Part of the learning of our organization is that you try things and you keep constantly adjusting until they work better for your community. In this case, we started with drawing people to a central point for a leadership school, and pretty quickly realized that transporting people isn't very sensible. Much better if you can do it to sort of circuit ride an area and have meetings in people's own villages so that they can easily attend them. So we have village level and block level leadership schools. People for those schools are interviewed and selected. We're looking for people who have the broader community at heart. We're not looking particularly for people with higher education. If people have it, it's fine. But someone illiterate can be a very good community leader. So as we do interviews and invite people to be at the leadership schools, we're looking for those leadership traits, and usually end up with a mix of people with some education and some not. The legal literacy camps are of particular interest to me since I'm a lawyer. There is a network all over India called the National Legal Services Authority, and there are state legal services authorities. So in US, we would call it the Legal Aid Office. Here, they are not very active or engaged in many places. It varies state to state, it varies district to district, but one of the roles we have played is in revitalizing the Legal Services Authority for the main district in which we've been working. That seems like real success, because if we are able to inspire and encourage and keep on the right track that kind of large national network, then we can have a lot more impact than we have in our small local area. One of the things I'm invited to do here, which is kind of amazing for a foreigner, is to go to the National Judicial Academy and be at workshops as a resource person with judges who are heading the legal services authorities in the various states. So I always love that opportunity. So the results of this work with citizens is better public service delivery and citizen leadership. Particularly, you see the difference with women, because depending on the community, they may not be that encouraged to be leaders. In addition to working with citizens, we work with the institutions. We have a separate team that does it. The institutions, of course, are elected or appointed. And so there's no issue about selecting them. They have been selected by either the electorate or an appointer. What we find is that these institutions that have so much responsibility, as I mentioned earlier, often don't have much orientation as to what their roles and responsibilities are. And so we work with them on that, as well as how to do microplanning, which basically just means village planning. And we assist them with budget submissions, proposals to the state departments that could assist them. We also convene collectives of women who are village level institution members, and those are very powerful. The women learn from what's going on in other villages. These are organized on block level, so they're learning from a regional group of women, and that has proven to give people a lot of confidence. So as you see, accessing government funds and increasing the role of women in village governance are results of this work. In water, we have worked building check dams and various structures that affect the environment to cause the water to percolate into the water table. Here, where there's monsoon, followed by very dry stretches, it's really important when the water does come down to capture it. In addition to storing it in the ground, we help people with rainwater harvesting into storage tanks so that they can use it later in the year. Along with that goes the need for filtering water so that it's safe to drink. I think there's been news coverage of Prime Minister Modi's effort to have clean India, Swachh Bharat is the Hindi. And there's a big emphasis to have people use proper sanitation. One of the big impediments to proper sanitation here is the lack of water. So this all fits together. It's important to harvest rainwater for drinking, for irrigation, for sanitation. It affects livelihoods and food security. Another aspect of water management, of course, is wastewater management, that too can be filtered by the earth and go back into the water table if it's properly channeled. If it's not properly channeled, people can be getting malaria from standing water on the streets. So we're looking to increase water for irrigation, for drinking. In particular, we've done a number of school drinking water projects. This is another mystery for me as to why the schools don't automatically have water for children. And in part, when responding to governmental questionnaires, the school officials who are everybody's under such pressure, they will say yes if they have water delivered by a truck to the school. And of course, that is having water at the school, but it's not the same as having a piped water connection or a pump that brings water up from underground that is perhaps a better quality than water from a truck. So at any rate, water management is, as I mentioned in the beginning, a huge issue. Here's one of our farmers in a field of millet. The work with farmers is largely through demonstration on their own fields to show methods for having greater crop productivity, ways to save water, reduce the cost of cultivation. Often, there's subsidized fertilizer, but that causes people to use more fertilizer than they need for the crop that they're growing. So we're teaching basic science to farmers so that it will help them in managing their input into their agriculture and to get greater output. There's attention to soil health, which, if it has the proper micronutrients and it has proper moisture, can produce that better yield. There is an extension service here, and they do soil testing. So in part, we try to make that system connect properly with the farmers so that they are able to find out what micronutrients are missing from their soil and figure out how to replace them. There's a group of women farmers we work with in Rajasthan, and they started out as a self-help group and have been collecting small amounts of money, basically microfinance. They have funds that they keep and pool, and those, of course, are very helpful as they do more with farming to be able to buy things when they need them and then pay back the fund when they have their revenue from crops. Because we are in a semi-arid area, the use of sprinklers and drip irrigation is really important, so we demonstrate that all the time. We have an interesting rural research unit that conducts needs assessment, baseline studies, midterm studies, impact studies. And from those studies, we often learn what's working, what's not. We can make midterm corrections in the way we're approaching something. We've also conducted research for the ministry and for what used to be called the Planning Commission, now has a new name, Niti Aayog. And we have done collaborative research. One of the interesting examples of that is that we worked with Canadian universities on living with climate change. And so researchers in a number of different areas, including Nepal and Pakistan, looked at the way that farmers were adapting to climatic change. One of the real joys of what we do is community media. And community radio certainly is an inspiration for everybody who's connected with it. And that includes children, women who may be otherwise pretty domestically homebound, and men who have a variety of interests. The radio covers everything from programs for children, Gali Gali Sim Sim, which is Sesame Street. I had a program on air for years, and this was funded by the agriculture department. So there are a number of programs for farmers, and they're not just for farmers, but they're by farmers. The call-ins are very important. People can leave messages. And so the whole point of community radio is to get the community voice out there, not just broadcast some NGO ideas. So our community radio team is out in the community all the time, finding out what people are curious about and concerned about and interested in. In addition to the radio, we have many of the people we serve are not literate, or even if they're semi-literate, they don't have a lot of literature to read. So wall paintings, flyers, other handouts are used to convey information to people. We have an example here of a poster, and of course it would be used for telling a story. And the story is that in the upper left, there is a daycare center that is totally chaotic. The sign is hanging, and the kids are all over the place. So the idea is, the main picture of that poster is, here is an organized daycare center where the children are engaged. They're hearing a story. The teacher is teaching. You can see various educational tools around. Their play tools. There's a slide. So these posters and wall paintings try to convey some of the actions that will lead people on a path toward development. Here's a painting that was done by some students from, or at least designed. I'm not sure if they actually painted it or some of the team painted it, but it was designed by students from University of Florida who work with Nourish International, which engages students from lots of different institutions to collecting funds for and doing projects that they think are important in terms of development. So here we see the reminder to wash your hands and brush your teeth, and the whole idea that water is really important to drink and use for. There's a picture of a toilet, that it's important to have good sanitation and use water for it. And of course, the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, how to wash your hands, which is critically important. Many people don't have water. So what do they do if they don't have water? People will use ash to sort of rub on between their hands, or they'll use sand to clean off their hands. But we know that soap and water are really important for good hygiene. We have lots of partners. The first is definitely the communities. If the communities are not interested in what we're doing doesn't matter at all. So it has to start with them, really. Our corporate social responsibility partners are Coca-Cola, Mosaic, which is a micronutrient company that sponsors some of our work with farmers. But not only do they sponsor work with farmers, they sponsor work in improving schools and in improving water in an area. So they have funded check dams to help the water percolate into the water table. So it's when you see the corporation understand that when you're working with a community, you're really working with the whole community, not just your particular business interest. It's fair enough for them to work on their business interest, but really the community is holistic, and it's exciting when corporations respond to them in that way. The Chamber of Commerce, we're working with one Chamber of Commerce in South India. It's a new connection, and we hope that they will connect us to many corporate partners. Government funding is critical for scaling anything. It's hard to do, I would say, after working with the organization for a while. International funders, we've had Embassy of Japan has funded one of our check dams. The German embassy is interested in funding water projects. So we have various international partners beside our own main donor in the US. Other NGOs are critical. We have a great partnership with Swadesh, which, in case you're familiar with India, there's a famous film leader, Rani Screwwala, who has an NGO called Swadesh in Maharashtra, and it works in 369 panchayats, and a panchayat is a cluster of villages, so it's actually much bigger than we are. And they like our governance program, so they have invited our governance team to train their own staff. So we are very excited about that. We're able to have impact in a place where we don't speak the language, and local people are taking up that approach of strengthening local governance. Radios is mentioned here. We are only permitted to have one radio license. We have it. So then how can we have more impact? We network with other radio stations. We share programs with them. They share programs with us. Sometimes we design common questions. The answers will be different according to the area where the station is broadcasting. Academic institutions, we have, I already mentioned University of Florida. We have a number of institutions. St. Catherine University in Minnesota regularly comes. University of Iowa regularly comes. Harvard University, I visited them a few years ago. They've been circulating information about us, and we have two or three law students who typically come during the winterim. And other partners, of course, are interns, Indian interns, as well as the international ones and individual donors. So here are some logos. This is a very Indian NGO kind of thing to do, is to have a sheet with all these logos. Jeff asked me, he said he thought that the audience would be interested in metrics. This is, of course, a huge issue as NGOs try to distinguish themselves from each other. How can you show to donors that what you do is effective? And it is an interesting thing for me as a lawyer to look at, because I suppose as a lawyer, I think a lot about causation and work that is done in villages. It's very hard to claim that you are the ones that brought about change. there are many factors affecting villages. So we struggle with this as to how to have metrics, how to express metrics. But one thing we can say is that we are working in 428 villages on governance, and we see the change in the success rate of the local people as they go about addressing challenges. The team gave me these statistics that 308 village committees have been activated. They were there on paper before, but they weren't doing anything. Now they're meeting and they're actually addressing local problems. And some of the concrete outcomes are things like building school boundary walls and rooms. I never understood when I first came why school boundary walls matter. Well, it's important to keep animals out and kids in, is the quick answer. And you see the statistics there about the radio station. I'll let you read these because I want to leave some time for us to interact. But I've been describing this kind of work for you. It is interesting, the crops that are grown here. Millet is very nutritious and it's not subsidized. So actually it should be so that more people would eat it, would get it. So with this, I think we can pause and take questions from you. Jeff will show you the chat box. What I'd ask you to do is please use A, B, or C as you answer a question, so it's real easy for us to tell where you're going.
Yeah, so thanks, Jane.
I
I want to make sure I explain. Jane thought it'd be interesting to have a little bit more of a conversation and was interested in hearing from all of you about answers to these three things. So I just put up a new chat box on the side. Actually, everyone will be able to see responses to these questions, but please type in and let us know, what interests you about this work. If you have, experience in these areas, we'd love to see more. And then, what in terms of social justice, what are the things that really get you charged up? And if you could, in your comment that we will all be able to see, list the letter that you're addressing. And I also want to remind folks, as Jane had asked, at the bottom of the screen, that would be a great place to enter any questions that you'd love to hear Jane's take on as we head towards the end of this hour. So thank you, Marissa, for typing in with some of your thoughts about the social justice issues. And Jane, I'll leave it to you to comment further as some of the comments are coming in.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. Women and girls' access to education and healthcare is critical. Where we're working, the girls are married off too young, and they are needed for domestic work. That's part of the reason they're married off. And so they are inhibited from having the right to education that they should have. So I totally relate with that as a backbone issue of rural development. It's very important for women, for girls to get education so that they can make choices for their families. It's important that they have proper health care. We work in one of the districts we work in does not have a gynecologist at a public hospital. And there is one nice male doctor who helps all of the women, but he's not a gynecologist. And so he is the one who cries most for, please find us a lady gynecologist to work with the women. There are 1 million people in that. There are 100,000 people in that district, and so it's really important that there be a gynecologist for that number of people. Okay, I see that James Miller is interested in how NGOs connect with communities they serve at the grassroots. That's a great question to pose. We are fortunate that the field team we've hired is by and large, from the area where they're working. So the connection is direct. They know people locally, and our role is to make sure that the field team has good training and exposure, um, solid values of our organization, so that they can spread that within the community. Cultural heritage preservation and empowering local identities. Yeah, that's a great one, Anasha. Um, in our situation, one of the activities is preserving old wells. So, for example, there are something called baoli, Baoli, which were built a long time back and were one of the ways that water was conserved and accessed in the old days. And so that kind of cultural heritage preservation occurs where we are. But it's also a wonderful field to go into in terms of helping people have a living, a livelihood that is related to their identity, if they're interested in that. And so we see, not in our area so much, but other areas I've visited, um, the idea of homestays in rural areas. Um, okay, now lots of things are coming. Have we encountered any backlash as women gain greater community voice, and what have we found to mitigate that? Okay, thanks, Susan. Um, the main district that we worked in the longest is majority Muslim, and so there have been a couple of fatwa over the years. In other words, the local religious leaders saying that people shouldn't work with us. And that arose, the first one arose when we had a life skill training for girls. The, the teacher had a reference book that had a diagram of the female reproductive system. It was not given to the children, it was not shown to the children, but somehow word got out about it and it caused a flap. Now, I think we're at a different point now. After that, that life skills training actually was closed down. It was just too inflammatory. But in the last couple of years, we've opened them again and are teaching people sewing. Now, that's going to be expanded to include computer learning, which will give people more employment opportunities, but to gain trust of families so that they will let you work with their girl children. You have to do something that they can understand. And sewing, they can understand, they see it's valuable, it's not scary. And so we're able to attract people by teaching those skills. While they're with us, other topics can be discussed as well. And we do a lot of training on governance so that they understand how women have a right to have a public voice in their community. We have not worked on microfinance. Other NGOs do. So we have a partner that has worked on microfinance, and that is located in Rajasthan, working with women, and they are using their microfinance in part for the agricultural projects I mentioned earlier, and they're eager for other livelihood opportunities. So I think microfinance is great. You have to have somebody in the community who is thinking of what the projects are you're going to finance with it. Okay, so then we have Anne, a one-year exchange program to the Federal Aviation Administration. Culture and environment matter. Absolutely. Even for those activities that are technical and non-political, supposedly. Right, absolutely. It's so important to be a good listener when you're in another culture, and um, and realize that there are totally different ways of approaching things from the way that you were raised to approach them. All right, James, teach for China, 50 miles from the Myanmar border. Yeah, right. Getting the community invested and active in your work. And a lot of that has to do with you listening to them and it being their work. Okay, you've also mentioned social justice issues, education, land rights, and law. Um, in terms of education, what we do, this is sometimes it seems too slow, but what we do is we work with the school management committee. As I mentioned, a lot of responsibility is at the village level. And so our view in terms of rural governance is that you have to teach the local people in charge what they can demand, how they can demand it. There have been times when we have had a donor who's paid for a teacher to come in. But frankly, if you pay for a teacher to go to a government school, that's a very short-term fix. The long-term fix is getting the government to have teachers to put in the government schools. And so the very long haul is for school management committees all over the country to be demanding teachers um, for teachers teaching to be a sufficiently attractive profession to get people to go into it. And one of the districts where we work, teachers do not want to go there. So how can the government make it more attractive to go there? We have this problem in the United States where there are school districts that people don't want to teach in, but it's critically important to figure out the solution to that teacher deficiency. Landesa is a marvelous NGO that works on land rights, and they particularly work on land rights of women and
Jane, we
law.
do.
So, yep, we're down to a couple minutes, I think.
We are, yeah. And I just wanted to remind people that if they've got a longer question that they want to have answered, I'm sure we can run over a couple minutes if that's okay with you, Jane. But Marissa chatted in with a great question that I'd love to hear your answer to. She's wondering how difficult is it, in your experience, for people to transition from the private sector to NGO work as you did? And then also, if you could comment on what are the main barriers of entry that you've found for new NGOs trying to enter the field?
Okay. All right. So the first question is transition. So I suppose part of my lawyerly answer is that I never really thought of myself as the private sector. but but I do know, I know people on our staff, and I know our founders, for example, were definitely private sector. So if we look at them, and actually I'll show you this page now. So there are two books. Seeds for Change is the biography of Suri and Etta Sehgal, who started the Sehgal Foundation. And as I said, they worked in the private sector and then bumped into the philanthropic sector when they sold their business and decided to give money. So there's a tremendous amount of learning that occurs when there's a shift between the private sector and the civil society sector and the philanthropy sector. I think if you're interested in that issue, you might want to read this book, and you can get a discount on it by writing to the lady indicated at the Missouri Botanical Gardens, which has the books for sale.
That's fantastic that you were able to negotiate that discount. Thank you, Jane.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. We're happy for people to read the books.
Got another
they're very
question.
well written. They're written by a. Okay.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off. Go ahead.
Okay, so just transition in terms of the people on my staff. The communications person had been in corporate communications, and she noticed a transition period. She totally loves what she does. Because really, what's not to love? You're doing work that is really important to people, fundamentally important, and it gives you perspective on everything else in your life. So, in terms of barriers of entry for NGOs, if you're speaking about India, there are many, I suppose. One is that there are many NGOs here, and so there are a lot of NGOs that don't have respect or credibility. I imagine that's the case anywhere, that building your respect and credibility as an NGO is really important, and until you have done it, you have a barrier to entry. In addition to that, in India, there's a limitation on who can receive funding from abroad, and there's a special law on that, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, and I'd be happy if anybody's interested in knowing more about that to talk about that on email. The other book shown here is the 15-year history of our foundation. For those of you interested in rural development or in India, you might want to read that. You had another question, Jeff?
Yeah, Jane, we have one other question that's come from Anashia, and it's a great one. What are the most vital skills that you think individuals need to have if they want to enter the development field?
All right, so there are many vital skills. Certainly listening pops to mind immediately. I would say flexibility is really important in terms of, you have an idea of what you think should be done, but you have to be really flexible to negotiate it with other people and see what works in the local context. So listening, flexibility. I think research of practical things is really important. There are one of the problems I have. I guess I can put it on this now. In the NGO sector is that there are thousands of pilot projects. There are thousands of good ideas, and it's really hard to figure out which ones you should spend your time on or which ones you should develop afresh. And so the idea of researching what others have done and trying to figure out the best adaptation or application to your situation is a very important skill. People like to develop things themselves. They think they have developed something new, and that is exciting, and we have a sense of identity through that. But it may not be the best thing for the community, so you should know what else is out there and present the community with options, get their feedback to see what's actually going to work for them. So those are three skills I think are important. Language skills are obviously extremely helpful wherever you are. You have to be able to talk with the people if you're working at the grassroots.
Jane, thank you so much for your time today. Obviously, you've listed here some links that people can follow for more information about the Sehgal Foundation and also your own email address. So obviously I know you made yourself available for people for follow-up questions and things like that, but it was really interesting to hear about your path and about the amazing work that you've done in India. So thank you again so much for your time and putting together this little talk today.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's been a delight.
And I also want to thank everybody for participating. Yeah, Jane and I both want to thank everybody for participating today. And I want to make sure that we've got some great webinars coming up over the next few months. And we also recently launched a unique online speed networking series. And so for those of you who aren't in cities where our alumni live, James, I know you mentioned you're 50 miles from the Myanmar border. If you've got a good internet connection, we provide a great opportunity for you to connect with BU alumni around the world. And it's particularly in April, we're actually going to be doing on April 21st, online speed networking for alumni that work in nonprofits, in healthcare, and in education. So you can check out all the upcoming events and online engagement opportunities we've got on our website at bu.edu/alumni on the web. web. And as always, if you or any BU alum that you know would be interested in presenting a professional development or industry insiders webinar like Jane has done here today, please contact me at the Alumni Relations Office or by email at jtmurphy@bu.edu. Thank you everybody for your time. Have a great day or a great evening wherever you might be.
Thanks very much, Jeff.